We have a liftoff.
Hello and welcome back to Tennis Unfiltered with me, James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. It's the first or the second pod of October, I should say, and once again we find ourselves recording in the middle of a tournament because the Asian swing is even weirder and more post-apocalyptic than we ever thought it could be. I'm going to make an apology, first of all, before I introduce... Well, Calvin Betton, I need to make no apology for him. He makes apologies for himself. Well, actually, he doesn't at all. But he is here, as usual. I make an apology for George Bellshaw and his loud mouse, which, when I was listening back to the recording last week, I was bemoaning George's brand new government-sponsored mouse, which I can see he is now putting away. But George, have you got alternative pointing device, or are you just without ability to click on things now?
So I've got my little trackpad on my laptop anyway, but I was trying to trying to stave off kind of arthritis of an actual mouse. So the things I do for you guys, like
if you get an RSI because of your trackpad, George, you just sue us. That's fine, not a problem. We're absolutely swimming in cash.
George would be the first person ever to get arthritis from doing a podcast.
Yeah, very good, very good. What I should also do is read out a 5-star review because one's just popped into my inbox from Unlucky Punter, who says, new favourite tennis pod, stumbled on this podcast a couple of weeks ago and got listening, really impressed so far, and now look forward to this each week, more than the other award-winning tennis podcasts. Keep up the good work, guys. Well, there are many tennis podcasts out there, and we thank you for listening to this one. We don't win awards, but we win our own awards, which is maybe even sadder. Before we get into tennis, and there's lots to talk about, we'll talk about Jannik Sinner and a really great newsletter I read by Hugh Clark this week, and we'll talk a little bit of tennis tactics in there. We'll talk Iga Swiatek and Coco Gauff, both the matches they have been playing and the ones that they're not going to be playing. We'll have a look at Shanghai, because obviously we're in the middle of that, because that's how the tennis calendar works now. Stefanos Tsitsipas is back with his daddy. Diego Schwartzman's back being a daddy. And we're still arguing about the Billie Jean King Cup. But before any of that, Calvin, you kind of alluded to something off air just before we started today, which I thought was really interesting. You obviously coach two players at the moment, one of whom is Luke Johnson, who won yet another title yesterday, I believe, over in the States. But you're saying that actually he's had to really mould his schedule around Brexit.
Yeah, so Luke was in pretty good form before he went to the States, and he would have preferred to stay in Europe and play in the 100 and 125 challenges. But because of Brexit rules, as a British person, he's only allowed to spend, I don't know the exact amount, but he's only allowed to spend a certain amount of days. I think it's a certain amount of days every 90 or every year, or every rolling 6365 or rolling something. But basically, he'd used up his days in mainland Europe that he was allowed to spend. So he had to play somewhere else for a 3 or 4 week period. So he's had to go to the States and play. And to be honest, there's no difference in the standard of tournaments, in the standard of pairs, but there's less points in the 75s. And so while him and his partner Skander Mansouri have been in this great form, they've won 3 in a row. They've only been picking up the 75 points minus what they got last year at the same week, and so not been really flying up the rankings like you'd imagine. Basically because of Brexit, that he's had to plan his schedule around that, and I think he's got one more coming up this week in the States, and then he's not playing for a week, and then his days they've reset by then, so he can go play some more in Europe by then.
But Calvin, because it's important we have balance on issues like this, does he feel he's taken back control?
His serve has more sovereignty, so and that's what. And when he flew to America, I think he flew with a blue passport, so swings and roundabouts. Less points, less likely to get into Australian Open, even though he keeps winning, but sovereignty. So.
We should talk. We probably don't talk about Luke enough, given that he's won 3 in a row and is playing so well. But he's now ranked just outside the top 100. So what's your kind of plan for the next couple of months? You mentioned the Australian Open there. Is that going to come too soon, maybe?
I don't know, because it just depends if at this stage last year, Henry and Jules were probably. I don't know if they were around about the same ranking as Luke is now.
Maybe, yeah.
Or it would have been around the same. and then they ended up getting in. I think the problem is with Luke and Skander, his partner is ranked about 30 places below Luke. So it's unlikely they get in together because I don't think Skander's going to make 70. It might just come a bit too early for him. But I think they'll keep on playing together in the long term. So it might be a case that I think if Luke, basically what you need a combined, to guarantee getting in the slams, or guarantee-ish, you need a combined ranking of 140. So if he was to enter now, we'd have to get a singles or a doubles player ranked in the top 30. So, that's tough. Top 30 singles players tend not to play a whole lot of doubles in the slams. But I think what we'd be aiming for is to try and get up towards 100, and then you're basically looking at, top 40, top 50, and then maybe try and get a singles guy who fancies playing with a decent doubles player. But yeah, absolutely not giving up hope on it. It's one of those things that he's just going to keep winning. But it's tough to keep winning, especially because Skander, his partner, is playing singles. So the last 2 weeks he's won the doubles, and then the next day he's had to go and play singles. So I don't think he's had a day off in about 4 weeks now. And then I know he's playing singles again today. I think he had yesterday off. Sorry, but again they were travelling. So so we'll see. Hopefully, but I think looking at the long term, I'd certainly expect him to be playing 3 of the slams next year at least.
And since we're on Calvin Stable, I mean, for people who've maybe not been following Henry Patton's progress since obviously disappointment of getting injured in the summer, and then the US Open, which obviously we talked about, he's had a couple of new partners over the last couple of weeks. He's out in Spain at the moment, is he?
Yeah, he played 1 week with Luke when Luke switched side and played on the Ad, and played in Saint-Tropez, which was a bit of a rough week, that just because the rain was so bad and there was no practice, couldn't get a practice in, and then they drew the second seeds, Arniedo and Weisborn, were a good pair, and lost in a close one to them, 10-7. And then he played with JP Smith, an Australian guy, and they lost in the final in France 2 weeks ago in a very close match in the final. I think it was 2 tie breaks, against 2 very big serving German lads, Franzen and Javens. And then he wasn't actually going to play last week, but there was nobody around to practice with, basically, at home. So he said he just was going to go and play with Charlie Broom, who's one of his best mates in tennis. So they just had a week, and they won a match, and then they lost to Maxim Cressy and Otto Virtanen, who are a very, very big hitting pair.
I was going to say, I can't think of a bigger serving pair of singles players there, in fairness.
Otto Virtanen can hit a tennis ball. On return as well. It's not just serve. He's a very, very clean ball striker. And famously, what I always remember about Otto Virtanen is I saw him break a Wilson Blade tennis racket across his knee once, which is some going, because if anyone who's ever played with a Wilson Blade knows it is solid graphite, and he snapped it straight over his knee. So he has a very, very strong knee.
Yeah, clearly.
But yeah, and then this week, he's starting a new partnership this week. He's going to play with Francisco Cabral, at least until the end of the year, and hopefully going forward.
For people who don't know Francisco Cabral, which in fairness includes me until about a week ago, what does he bring to the table? I mean, he's a top 50 doubles player, isn't he?
Yeah, he played with Jamie Murray actually last year for a few tournaments. Very good player. Had a lot of success. Again, not really. He played a lot with his good friend Nuno Borges, who's a singles guy, and they had a lot of success last year. But as always, Nuno's doing well singles, and the singles guys don't want to commit to doubles, and they don't want to practice doubles, which is a big thing. So he's been playing with a few different partners this year, but mainly Rafael Matos. But he had a chat with Henry, and they wanted to give it a go together. They knew each other. They played each other against a few times. So, so they're going to have a go. And he's a big guy, almost as tall as Henry. Big serve, solid return, solid at the net. Yeah, looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Exciting stuff. Yeah, you say almost as tall as Henry. I have to say, the first time I watched Henry play, I think it was last year, maybe at Nottingham, and he is a tall guy, but he's also just a big guy. Like his feet, his thighs, his sort of limbs, everything is like in proportion. If you like, he's an incredible athlete with and can we say good touch for a big lad?
I mean, he's got a great touch. That's his one of his main strengths, really. But yeah.
Excellent, exciting stuff. Right, well, let's move on to the Far East, away from America, from Europe, from Brexit, and to China, where, of course, famously, there's no politics involved. Jannik Sinner won a title in Beijing. He beat Daniil Medvedev and Carlos Alcaraz. George's prediction about him being El Flopitano, starting to age like old milk, I suspect, George. I'm sure you will have a defence coming, and I will. Once I have kind of introduced this section with an email from Marianne. You can always email us, tennisunfiltered@gmail.com. She says, I've loved Sinner since I saw him in his first next-gen tournament. The last few years, my enthusiasm has waned a tad, as I think one of you may have said also. He's got the skill, but does he have the it factor? Alcaraz, Rune, and Shelton have bravado, balls, and belief. Will Sinner win a slam? Can nice guys finish first? I'm encouraged by his win in Beijing. What do you think? George, he needs only 4 wins to set a record for the most match wins for an Italian man in a single season, which is, I don't know how impressive that is. It's a stat that has too many caveats, but he's up to world number 4 and he's into ATP World Tour Final, so he's going well and he's making you look like a right idiot.
I think he's possibly down to only 3 now, since I actually wrote that sentence, James. So, I mean, my defence, as ever, is that I was talking about the longevity of Sinner v Alcaraz, in the sense that I did say I think Alcaraz will improve a lot more than I suspect Sinner will, and I think he's got a higher ceiling, and my worry is that matchup won't age very well. I think we risk seeing the best of it now when they're more closely matched, but I think Alcaraz will get so much better. I'm not sure we're going to see that from Sinner. But I thought the email you sent, James, I've completely forgotten the chap's name
Hugh
who wrote
Clark.
it.
If you want to find him on Substack, it's Hugh Clark with an E.
I thought was a really interesting piece, both kind of picking out their kind of current dynamic of a rivalry, but also kind of making the case about Sinner's incremental improvements. And, you know, with a guy like Darren Cahill on board, it's perhaps not such a surprise to see, you know, Sinner's results have been taking that next step forward at a level it is hard to get there. I think getting to world number 4 for him is no mean feat, you know, and I think we'd probably all sit here right now and say comfortably the 4 guys who are the men's 1 to 4 are probably the guys we'd want to be seeing in the semi-finals of slams at the minute if we could pick the 4 we wanted. Probably we'd want to be picking the right matchups between them, so maybe Sinner, Alcaraz, and then Medvedev, Djokovic probably is the 2 semis you'd want with an Alcaraz Djokovic final in your dream kind of slam. But I think he's obviously had a really good year. He is improving. I'm still not convinced there's enough of a kind of plan B, C, D with Sinner, whereas I think Alcaraz just has so many more different routes to victory. And as you said, I think this matchup's a bit odd because Alcaraz is sort of being sucked into Sinner's game right now. I think as he grows as a player, perhaps gets tactically smarter as well as kind of shot brilliant. I suspect Alcaraz will pull away, but happy to be wrong. It's a prediction I'm not invested in from a heart perspective. It's just a head one, I think.
I think this tactical matchup, Calvin, is going to be one that we talk about a lot over the next 10 years. I think, as George has alluded to there, we often talked about Sinner being that quite one-dimensional. Alcaraz isn't, but it did seem, and I'm kind of lifting from Hugh's newsletter here because it was really good and it kind of spoke to a lot of things I thought about the match, that it almost looked like Alcaraz got sucked into trying to dictate when Sinner was trying to dictate, you know, almost like, well, I've managed to get to this big forehand you've hit, I'm going to hit a bigger one back. Whereas I would say, Calvin, that Alcaraz's strength is when you're hitting the ball well, he can mix it up and provide something different and move you around or bring you forward.
Yeah, but I mean, I disagree somewhat with George there. I think that although I think Alcaraz will be a better player, for sure, I think he's a better player now, and I think he will continue to be. I think Sinner will always cause him problems, just for two reasons. One, that mentally, if you beat somebody regularly early on in your career, it's rare that, and that player's a good player and of a similar age, it's rare that you ever sort of just start beating them all the time then. So I think that, but also I just think tactically it's a tough matchup for Alcaraz because Sinner hits the ball really flat and really hard. And in order to get a hit on it, like Alcaraz likes to dominate the rallies, he needs a ball with shape in order to do that, and then he can hit it back with more shape and more power to hit a heavy ball. It's tough to hit a heavy ball like Alcaraz likes, especially on his forehand, off a flat, hard, deep ball that is skidding through at you. So I think that it will always be one that he struggles with just because Sinner takes away the way that he wants to play. So yeah, he's got more in his game and he's more adaptable than Sinner, and Alcaraz will be able to find solutions. I think it will always end up being a sort of 50-50 one, maybe even that Alcaraz might edge it overall, but I think it will always be close just because Sinner can take away Alcaraz's plan A. And if you can ever take anyone's plan A away, then you've already got them in a bit of trouble. Whereas I don't think that Alcaraz can take Sinner's plan A away. Strangely, he's one of the ones who can. But yeah, I think it's, and yeah, like you say, James, I think he would ideally that's what he'd do, but it's not what Alcaraz tends to do, and it's tough to do that if somebody's hitting the ball flat and hard all the time. It's tough to just change it round and throw in a little bit more, because that's not the way he has those little flourishes, but also at the same time he's not Dan Evans. He's not going to be chipping slices away and that kind of thing against Sinner, because I think if he did that, I don't think he'd beat Sinner either, because you've taken away the best part of his game.
If Alcaraz is struggling so much to deal with kind of Sinner's plan A, Calvin, what is it that other players are doing that means Jannik Sinner's not beating them on a regular basis? Why does Sinner struggle so much against Djokovic, for example? What's kind of the big differences?
Djokovic kind of like, if you look at his swing speeds, he's kind of like uses a bit more like it's less dependent on whatever. Alcaraz is a fantastic player and he's got plenty to his game, but his plan A is dependent on getting behind the ball and ripping huge forehands that have heavy topspin and come with pace. So that's not what Djokovic's plan A is. Djokovic's plan A is he's going to make a lot of balls. He's going to defend well. He's going to put you in strange positions that you don't really ideally want to be in, and he's just going to play the match very well. Whereas Sinner doesn't take away Djokovic's plan A at all, or even he doesn't take away how he wants to hit the ball, because Djokovic is used to playing against that kind of thing. Whereas Alcaraz, I think, just if you look at the shot mechanics of what he wants to do, you can't generate. It's easier to generate heavy, pacey topspin off a ball that's coming at you that's with some sort of heavy, pacey topspin. And you watched him today be, twice now in the last few weeks, he struggled against Dan Evans. He's beat him a couple of times. And the reason for that is that he's not getting that ball off Dan Evans either. But he's beat him. This is not, I'm not saying for a minute that this is a weakness in his game. I'm saying that it makes him work harder if he can't do what he wants to do. But when he plays Djokovic, for example, Djokovic is hitting, he does hit a shaped, heavy-ish ball. And so he can tee off on it. He can't do that against Sinner on his forehand.
I've got a bit of a theory that's been brewing in my head for a while, and I suspect you're both going to say it's total nonsense because you know a lot more about tennis than I do. But I was watching Arsenal Man City on Sunday, and I largely found it a pretty boring game because it was admittedly two really great managers and two great footballing minds in Pep Guardiola and Mikel Arteta, but two from the very same school, and two who knew each other almost a bit too well, and two who'd kind of coached their team to within an inch of their life to a certain way of playing. And it largely cancelled each other out until, Gabriel Martinelli added something different and Arsenal got a bit lucky late on, I would argue. Anyway, with the kind of the the allowance, the permission given to on-court coaching, with the fact that you've got Jannik Sinner with Darren Cahill in his box and give a decent amount of advice during the match anyway, even when it wasn't legal. Is there an element here of we're seeing less of a rivalry on the court between two people trying to outthink each other, and actually it's a rivalry of a player and a player and a coach, and that it's kind of happening a bit more the way people said it might on court, that it is coaches almost marionetting matches a little bit more?
Well, I mean, without wishing to go to Football Unfiltered, I'll first raise the question about if Mikel Arteta is a great football mind, being that he has precisely the same amount of league titles as I do under his under his management. No, on to the actual question. He's a good manager. He's all right.
He's done a good job. He's built a decent team in a club that has like a perennial problem with getting over the line. Yeah. And they almost did.
Spent more money than any club in Europe over the last 3 years. But yeah, done a good job. I don't think so, James, because of what you said, because I just don't think that, for all, and I've discussed this point again, like the impact of a coach on the tennis court. We're talking about, if I'm watching a tennis match, and without sounding like a bell, I think I'm a pretty good tennis coach. And I think anybody's like this. I think if I can have a 5 or 6 or 7% impact on a match, I've done a decent job there in the day from an on-court coaching once the match starts. And that's unlikely. You're maybe looking at percentages. Whereas a football manager can have a huge impact during the match, just because you can change players, you can change position. You can't suddenly give Jannik Sinner a great slice backhand in the middle of the match. Whereas if you see that damage has been done on a football pitch, you can change formation, and then if that doesn't work, you can change players. So this is one of the things that cracks me up when people go on about how bad it is that we're now allowing tennis coaching, and this doesn't happen, this doesn't happen. It's just absolute nonsense. You might get, I think it's good for the fans that they can watch it, and you might get a little bit of change in it, and as well, it's not like, and this is the same for any sport, it's the same for football. It's not like you just tell a player what to do and they just implement it. Like that's not how it works. That's definitely not how it works. So I don't think so. It's interesting to see, but having said that as well, like, what does Cahill actually tell Sinner to do differently? Like, it's just the same stuff. He twats the ball really hard. Like, that's it.
George, I don't know if you're still with us, but on my screen, you're frozen with your finger up in the air. So
yeah.
I'm excited to see what you've got to say, if indeed you do have anything to say. But no, I cannot see. I can see vaguely you, but I certainly can't hear you. You're not moving.
Is George down into this podcast with carrier pigeon or something? It's unbelievable.
Yeah, incredibly, George lives in North London, which I think has some of the best internet coverage of anywhere in Europe, and now completely black screen. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff as always from Bellshaw. Maybe we're better off without him. Well, it's worth talking a bit about the final as well, because he beat Daniil Medvedev, which I think is also a significant result because he had never beaten him before. They played 6 times as professionals, including in 2 other finals, all on hard court as well, albeit mostly indoors, which I think probably is a bit of a tougher matchup for Sinner. Calvin, just from a mental perspective, especially a guy like Sinner who has had some big wobbles, let's face it, match points at the US Open against Alcaraz last year, for example, and various other matches where he's been ahead and had a chance and frankly choked. How big is it to kind of just earn that first victory against a player, and especially against Medvedev, who, on outdoor hard court in China, pretty tough opponent?
I think it's quite a significant one, actually, particularly because it's not just... Medvedev's a tough player, a tough hurdle to get over if you've not beaten him. Just the way, because he has such a unique way of playing, that he's tall, lanky, doesn't hit the ball particularly hard, makes a lot of balls, hits to a length, serves big and flat, but not particularly accurately. It's more of a unique style than anyone else. Well, I've said before, there's never been a tennis player who plays like Daniil Medvedev at the highest level of the game. So I think it's both the name thing of knowing that you've beaten the 3rd best tennis player in the world, probably. I know rankings change a lot, but It's more that, and also convincing yourself that you can you can win against this style of play, which I think is particularly important for Sinner there. But also, he's not been great against the top players in the world in his career, other than Alcaraz, who he has a good record against. But the other guys, Djokovic, Zverev, Medvedev, up until then, he doesn't have a great record against, does he?
Yeah, and I think that is just one of those things as a young player. And we also have to remember, Calvin, like Jannik Sinner is 22, I think. He turned 22 this year. He's still a bit of a baby. And like also, I think physically, we talk a lot about Holger Rune's physicality lately because of this back thing that's going around. Talk about Alcaraz being like a fully developed adult at 18. Jannik Sinner hasn't really been that. Like you look at him and he's I don't know whether this is unfair or offensive, but he looks noodly. He looks like he's got noodles for arms. I think Ferrero once said it about Alcaraz, but he does. He looks sort of flimsy. And
he's a skinny lad. There's no question about it. He's a skinny lad. He doesn't have, remarkably, the skinniest legs in men's tennis. And this astonished me because you don't expect it. Is Berrettini.
Really?
Who has the thinnest legs I've ever seen on a male.
Wow.
Of a male athlete. And you don't think that because he's a big guy up top. But Sinner's not far behind. He's just a skinny guy, and I don't know whether he's one of those guys who just, some people just can't put on weight. And I think he might always be a bit like that. But it's a weird one with him. I think because of the way he came on the scene, he came through so quickly, and with this dominant style of play, that we all thought that he was just on a pathway to, to be relentlessly at the top. And he kind of has been, but he kind of hasn't either. He kind of sits on his own, doesn't he? As you can't lump him with other players in terms of, like, if we say, like, I'd say you've got Djokovic and Alcaraz, who are the top two players in the world.
Yeah.
And then you've got you've got that kind of section of fully fit. I'll stress fully fit. You've got like Medvedev, Zverev, Tsitsipas. I know Medvedev.
Rune.
Rune. I'd say all those, and then you've got the guys then below them who aren't doing as much. And I know that
Rude, Fritz.
Having said that, I'd probably put a lot of those the same. Whereas, like, which one of those would you put Sinner in?
Yeah.
Like, and would you put him above them or below him? If this is a guy who's like, he has a winning record against Alcaraz, but also he's never been. Has he been in the semi of a slam?
Yes. He made the semi at Wimbledon, didn't he? This year.
Yeah. But it hasn't been in the final of a slam. So, but he's tough to categorize. Like, is he? You could. What I'm trying to get is, you could equally make an argument that Sinner is the fourth best player in the world, and you can make an argument that he's the 14th.
Yeah. By ranking, he is now the fourth best player in the world, which maybe represents, if he goes in, he's number 4 seed, because the slams are everything these days. We can't get away from that. And if you're the number 4 seed, it's massively different from being the number 5 seed. Like, your draw is just so much easier, and it gives you so much more protection in that. The middle of the tournament, the first week, seeds all basically have the same draw, but third and fourth rounds, that's where you get that extra protection. And all of a sudden, if Andrei Rublev was number 4 seed at a slam, I'm sure he would have a better record in quarterfinals than he does. But the reality is that if you're between 5 and 8, you get this guaranteed draw where you're going to face a massive player in the quarterfinals. So I think there is potentially this is a big, as a lot of Spanish managers say, a big moment in Jannik Sinner's career. George, do you feel that way? We just, while you were fanning around in the 1990s, we were saying that he's 22 and, he's only really just starting to fill out his body and, he's starting to break into that. Do you feel about the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of kind of agree with Calvin's reflections, really. Like, part of me wants to say he's outright the 4th best player in the world. Part of me wants to say, well, I still don't back him to reach the semi-finals every week, which I guess maybe we got too used to this with kind of the big four, if you like, that sort of consistency, and it's sort of skewed my brain by recency bias. But I still wouldn't look at many draws that Jannik Sinner's in and feel confident he's definitely going to be getting to the quarters or the semis. And that's not because I think of his ability. I just think there's too many players that I think he can lose to. Whereas I don't really think that with Alcaraz. Even Medvedev, we know he can have his weird up and downs throughout a year. But in a US Open, broadly speaking, I'm saying there's only 4 or 5 players I think can beat Medvedev. So there's probably 15 I think would have a pretty reasonable chance of beating Sinner.
I think that what needs to happen now going forward, and what happened with all that, you look at all the big four, and you look at Medvedev and Alcaraz on top of that, is that when they win, they go on runs of like this type of thing. So this was a good tournament that he's won. What they would do was they would go and win this one as well now in Shanghai, and then they go to Paris and win that, or make final in that, and then they'd go to the year-end finals and make the final. And that's how you do it. That's how those guys all did it when Alcaraz just started winning everything. I guess last year. I mean, he slowed down a bit on the clay as it happened, but he was just going through winning everything. And then I remember Djokovic did the same, Murray did the same. Whereas Sinner's like, it hasn't happened yet, but like Rune looked like he was going to do that, and then he's just fallen off the wayside. Medvedev went on that run, was it 2020, where he just won everything on the hard court. He lost in the final of the US to Nadal, or was it 19?
19, yeah.
He lost the final of Nadal, and then he just won everything up until the year-end finals, didn't he? And that's how you've got to do it. You can't do it by just, what we don't want to see is him winning. What we don't want to see is we don't want to see him winning like, this one, and then going out in the quarters of Shanghai, or something. Because quarters is decent, but if you're going to make the breakthrough, otherwise you're just going to be the guy who wins some 500s.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I've been distracted because my dog has just decided that this is the moment that he wants to get involved.
Is this your first announcement of a dog, James?
I mean, I suppose so. His name is Buzz. He's a retired greyhound, and he was pretty successful. He's also quite needy. So he basically, he's only in here because he wasn't in here before, so now wants to be in here. And my missus has let him in because he was crying about it. There you go. He's taking his place on the sofa, which used to be my favourite spot on the sofa, but now it's his. But anyway, there you go. It's quite enough dog chat. People who watch on YouTube will have seen him in the background, and I'm sure you'll see a lot more of him because he's an absolute unit, as most ex-racing dogs are. I don't know how much more there is to say about Jannik Sinner, other than that he has won 2 matches already in Shanghai, so any fears of a quarterfinal defeat. But he is now playing Ben Shelton in the last 16 in a match that probably would have taken place by the time you hear this. So we'll see how that evolves. I was just going to say one thing. I wanted to look up the titles that he's already won, and when I look at titles that people have won, I always think about like the bookends of the year as meaning a bit less. Like if you've got lots of titles, around February, March, or like, after the US Open, and a lot of his titles have come in those slots. Like he's won Sofia twice in November. He's won an Australian title up in February in the run-up to the Australian Open. He has, of course, now won the Canadian Masters. Like that feels like a really big moment. 1,000 title there in Canada, and that's in the heart of the season. I think when people are maybe in a bit better shape, but I think he's got to win more titles in the heart of the year for me. It's great to win Beijing, but I don't know how much credence I'm going to be giving that. We've lost George again, but we'll soldier on. Let's talk a bit about Shanghai. There's a couple of results. Well, there's actually one result I really want to ask you about, Calvin, because his name came up either last week or the week before, which is Roman Safiullin. Now, it only came up in the context of Andy Murray complaining about not having any data on him. Well, it doesn't appear to have made the blind bit of difference because I think he had a lot more data on him this time around, and he beat him 3-2 in Shanghai, and he then went on to beat Alexander Zverev 3-1. So it maybe wasn't a fluke. He did lose to Ben Shelton in 3 sets, but I don't know if he's someone you've come across before, Roman Safiullin, Calvin. He's been around the block a bit. He's 26 and he's up into the top 50, I think, for the first time in his career. But he's obviously made the quarterfinals of Wimbledon this year. But other than that, I don't think he's really made great shakes.
Yeah, I actually watched him live at the US Open play doubles because he was in the match that Henry and Jules lost to Bopana and Ebden, and Bopana and Ebden beat Safiullin and I'm gonna say Golyabev maybe.
Okay.
In the round before, and he was perhaps the worst doubles player I've seen play professionally, certainly at a slam. Towards the end of the match, I think the second set was relatively close, maybe a break a serve at the end or something, and he moved out of the way of 2 shots. I didn't leave them and didn't duck or anything, didn't take him by surprise. He just moved and let the ball go over his shoulder. So that's all I've seen of him live. I've say that's all I've seen him live. I've seen him at challenger tournaments. He hits the ball very, very hard. The closest thing you can probably say in terms of stylistically is Karatsev. He's one of this generation of Russians that there are a lot of them now, actually, and it wasn't always the case. The Russians when you used to think about the Russians, they'd be solid, they'd make a lot of balls, they compete hard, and that kind of thing. Whereas now there's this generation of them who just hit the ball phenomenally hard and low percentage. They just go after it, and they don't often. It's one of those big myths actually that we have in tennis that you always think, the Eastern Europeans, they're such fighters. It's not necessarily the case that, and such as Safiullin and Karatsev, they're very much. I think journalist Rob Smythe once cottoned the phrase, "They're good time Charlies." They when they're playing well, they're very, very good, and when they're not, they're not.
Yeah, he's interesting because he won a junior Grand Slam as well in 2015. He won the Junior Australian Open. And we always say that in the men's game, especially, that means a lot less. But I do sometimes wonder if you see the late bloomers. Like, I often find that when someone makes a breakthrough like this, I go and look at their record and go, "Oh, he did win a Junior Slam, but it was a while ago." And so obviously, like Liam Brody was a very highly rated junior and had that similar kind of had a few problems with his forehand and had a few other problems, like just sorting himself out a bit and working out what he wanted to be. And then and all right, he's not top 50. He's made top 100 though, and that's an achievement in itself. So I do wonder if there's a bit of the late bloom sometimes with these guys who are very good when they're 17 and play a lot of juniors and go and win things. So we'll see how that works out.
It's one of the truisms of tennis, actually, that when people you always get tennis parents in particular when it's always coincidentally when their children are not very good as juniors, and they go, well, you don't have to be very good as a junior to be a senior. And it's like being a great junior does not make you. It does not guarantee you being a great senior. But all of the great seniors, all the great professionals, should I say, have all been great juniors.
Right.
And this was always the one where there's still. I know when it came about when Sinner was breaking through, actually, on what we were just talking about, that I had a conversation with George. It might even have been on this podcast, or it might have been on one of the videos that I did for George before we started doing the podcast, where George said, we had a discussion whether he could be world number one. There's still, and Sinner was not a great junior. I don't think he ever made the top 150 as a junior.
Right.
But and he played a lot of tournaments as a junior. It wasn't one of those where they just don't play a lot, like Alcaraz and Nadal and that kind of thing. And I think I said then that there's never been a world number one that hasn't been a great junior, a very good junior.
Sure,
should we say? Like somebody who I'd say has made top 15 or ish in the world. So it's one of those things. But you do get, people used to say this about Sampras. I think like they used to go, Sampras was never a great junior, and look what he did. And it's like you looked at his ITF profile, and he was like ranked 8 in the world. He was the 8th best junior in the world, and on the whole planet there were only 7 18 and under players better than him. He just didn't win slams.
Yeah. Interestingly, Jannik Sinner's peak ranking as a junior was 133. So he did make top 150, but only just. He never played the main draw of a high-level Grade 1 junior event, which is pretty remarkable, really. So I think if I learn anything from that, and maybe there's nothing to learn from that, but if you do, it's that, he's a scrapper when it comes to long-term improvement. He can get better.
I mean, but also what I'd say about Safin is that, he's still not that old. What is he? Is he 25?
26.
Yeah, so, in the men's game, and he's been around the top 100 a bit now, I think. It's not, that, it's not like he's 31 and breaking through.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah.
I guess it's just, the great problem with tennis is that, like, the lens has always been getting skewed by the big 3, for example, big 4, for example. And it's the same, like, Alcaraz has kind of made us forget that you don't have to be a world beater at 19. You can take until you're 25 to really make it work. One of the other matches I wanted to point out from Shanghai this week is Evans versus Alcaraz, which was today. Alcaraz won in straight sets, a couple of amazing points. What is it about this matchup, Calvin, that it just always seems to produce really, really entertaining tennis, even if it's always pretty much going to end the same way. Ever's only taken 1 set off him in 4 meetings, but I've enjoyed every single one of them.
I mean, just 2 good tennis players. 2 good tennis players to watch as well. I think 2 good tennis players to watch who don't play in the same way, which is always makes for great matches. That kind of thing. And Evo tends to be involved in a lot of really good matches just because he's different.
Yeah.
It's one of those. How do you practice to play against Evo? Who are you gonna get? If you got him first round and you want to practice set against somebody similar, who are you gonna get? And there isn't anybody. Really.
No.
So yeah, it was a high level match. I watched most of it. And Alcaraz said after, and he was honest in it. I think he wasn't blowing smoke up Evo's ass. He said it was one of the most difficult matches he's had this year, and you can tell he just doesn't enjoy playing it. He doesn't. He gets through it because he's a warrior, but he just doesn't enjoy playing it. And I spoke with Evo a little bit after, just by text, and he said the difficulty with Alcaraz is that he just doesn't. He doesn't have a point. Doesn't take a point off. He's just relentless all the time. And that's true. A lot of those younger guys, they're going to give you a game occasionally, or they're going to give you like a love 30 that you can get your teeth into. Whereas against Alcaraz, you just got to win every single point.
I feel like we've spent a lot of time because there are a lot of interesting matches to talk about. Talking about the men's game, and I was going to ask George to lead us into Coco Gauff, Phil, as our Coco Gauff expert, but we've lost him again, so maybe forever, who knows. So please send your CVs to tennisunfiltered@gmail.com for the George Bellshaw replacement. The only requirement is that you have a stable internet connection, which Bellshaw's fallen down on. So, but business as usual in the Coco Gauff arc, you might argue, because her long winning streak of 16 matches has finally ended, and it was by a familiar foe, Iga Swiatek, who beat her 6-2, 6-3. Of course, one of the big matches of the summer for Coco Gauff was her finally ending that one-sided head-to-head and getting a win over Iga Swiatek, but that seems to have been restored. Calvin, I suppose we were kidding ourselves if we thought that all of a sudden Coco Gauff was just as good as Iga Swiatek in that matchup. There's obviously still a lot of work to do there. Is that going to be the thing that holds her back from being a dominant force if she can't beat Iga Swiatek on a regular basis?
I think so, yeah. And I don't think she will beat on a regular basis. Might get the odd win, but I don't think it's going to be a great rivalry. That one, just because of, we're at that stage now, unfortunately, and you can make players at this level, at that standard, they're not going to get. And this goes for every player. It goes for Swiatek, Gauff, any player you want at that level. They're not going to get 15, 20% better at tennis. From now until the end of their career, if they get 5% better, that's a phenomenal achievement. But
does that apply to all the shots as well? Do you think you can't make a big improvement on if you've got one much weaker shot and maybe room to improve? Is there a big change you can make there, or is that so rare it's almost unheard of?
I think it varies, but I think I'm still inclined to say, yeah, that's the case. Again, I think if as a coach now, Coco Gauff hired somebody and she said, I want you to, they said, I will make your forehand 10% better, then she should absolutely snap their hand off at that. Because I think that's the best, that's the most I think you can get at that level. And to be fair, you make her forehand 10% better, it's quite a significant improvement. I don't think it's enough to beat Iga Swiatek. The problem is, what are you going to do with that? What can you do for a forehand? I know what the kind of things that I do. I'd talk about rhythm and momentum and that kind of stuff, but you can't be changing grips and stuff and changing swings and that kind of thing. And I think we often over-egg it, what you can actually do. I know that there was I know Petch used to talk about that Raducanu had changed her forehand technique and this kind of thing, but I think there were a couple of tweaks, but I think it was somewhat exaggerating to say that she changed her forehand. It's because that's all you can do. These players are playing. You don't get any closed season. The only time that they would have had a real moment to do this kind of thing was during the pandemic, when the first lockdown came. And there you had about 2 months where there was no tournaments or anything. But even at the closed season, you're going to go, say the season ends. When's the last week of the WTA?
Billie Jean King Cup Finals, which is another, end of November? Middle of November? Middle of November.
Right, say it's middle of November, right? Those girls have had a lot, they're going to need some time off. So they're going to probably take 10 days, 2 weeks off. You've then got 4 weeks before you have to be playing a tournament in Australia.
Yeah.
You're making technical changes in 4 weeks. Big ones.
Yeah, not just tweaks.
It's not going to happen. So for that reason, and I think a lot of it is mental as well, but you can't show me any player. I'd challenge anybody to show me any player who's already got to the top 20 in the game, or top 10 even, who has improved technically a shot throughout their career. And not improved it, sorry, who's gone from that's a real weakness to pretty good.